Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. So have you thought about installing a vanilla Arch system, but you're just a little bit unsure or a little bit nervous about the exact procedure? Well, worry not, this video is for you. I'll see you after the intro. Okay, welcome back. So, an Arch install. I did one months and months ago on a T430 ThinkPad. But the procedure has changed a little bit since then. So I thought it was time to refresh that video. But this time I've gone a step further. I'm going to back up my method of installing Arch with documentation from my GitLab page. So essentially all you have to do is copy and paste for most of the procedures. So if you're a little bit nervous or you're not feeling that confident about installing Arch, but you'd really like to give it a go, this could be for you. The reason I'm doing this, apart from refreshing the Arch install video, is personally I've installed Arch on a number of occasions, and the Arch wiki is great to follow, but it sort of breaks off at points, and it doesn't, for instance, allow you to continue about how to install Grub on the first installation page. You have to go on to another section, and after a while, we sort of customize the way that we do things and do a few extra steps to speed the process up. So what many of us do is we write our own text file or script, if you've got that sort of skill, and we follow that every time we do the installation. Now, I know EasyNix or EsNix has one, and he's in the process of turning his into a script at the moment as well, and his installation instructions are great. They include lots of the packages that he would normally install. What I'm going to do, I had my own text file with the stages of installing a desktop of my choice already written out, but I've just modified it slightly so it's more generic, so it applies to everyone, and I'm putting it on my GitLab, so you should all be able to print it out if you wish to, or more likely, I'm going to recommend that if you do this, you install over SSH. That means you can have a terminal open on your workstation and the text file, and you can just copy and paste a lot of the commands in. So why would you want to install a vanilla Arch system? Because you can. There are some great pre-configured Arch systems out there: Manjaro, Arco, Linux, etc. Endeavour. They're brilliant. I tend to stick to a vanilla Arch system for one reason and one reason alone. I tend not to like the customizations and the tweaks that other people do. So I would rather start from scratch and build up the system myself. That's what I'm going to go through now. So all you have to do is download the ISO from the Arch Linux page and follow along. I'd recommend, by the way, try this a few times in VirtualBox until you get the procedure off pat, and then do it on real hardware. But anyway, enough talk for now. Let's get into the installation. So you should see in front of you now the Arch ISO booted in VirtualBox. I've booted it in EFI mode, and you'll just get straight to this root prompt. Don't worry too much about this, because I'm going to recommend you do this over SSH. So really, we're going into this interface now just to check that we are connected and to start up the SSH service. I would recommend, before we go any further, that try to do this over an Ethernet connection. Even if you have to sit your laptop or something right next to your router, it's going to be easier. You may well have the option of connecting by Wi-Fi. You could run this command, Wi-Fi-menu, but that would very much depend on the drivers being available. So if you can do it over a wired connection, so much the better. And if you're on a wired connection, the chances are you will find that you are already connected. So I'm just going to do a ping google.com here. And yes, I can see I'm connected, so I'm going to Control-C to stop that. Okay, let's find my IP address. I do this through the command IPA. And I can see here that my IP, and it's the second interface there, EMP0S3, where it says in it, I'm 192.168.1.223. So that's the IP address that I'm going to SSH into. So, how do we set up SSH? Well, the first thing that you're going to need is to set up a password for root. There isn't a password on the root ISO, so let's set one up, and we do this simply by typing PASSWD. And it prompts me for a password, and it asks again. So root on the Arch ISO now has a password. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start SSH. Now, the way this Arch ISO is set up, it will permit root logins to SSH. So we don't have to mess about with any files. We simply do systemctl start sshd.service. And that's us done. So you can leave your machine alone wherever it is now, and you can move on to your main desktop, and you can SSH into this, and you can largely copy and paste from there on in. So let's move to my main workstation. So you can now see in front of you, I've just got a terminal open on my main workstation. One of the advantages is that I can make the text larger so you can see it more clearly. But on my other screen, I've also got a text file with the instructions for installing Arch that I can copy and paste across if necessary. You could also have the Arch wiki open should you wish to. It's the same thing essentially. So let's SSH into that, into that box. So we go SSH root at, and it was 192.168.1.223. Okay, it's checking the authenticity of the host. What we have to type here is yes, and we have to issue that password that we've just set for root. And we're logged in, and you can see the prompts change now. It's root at Arch ISO. So we're all set. So first things first, we need to set our key map. By default, the Arch ISO is set on US. So if you have a US key map, you've nothing to do here. You're set up by default. But if you haven't got a US keyboard, you'll need to set it up so that things like the pipe symbol and the @ symbol work correctly. To see a list of the different keyboard mappings, in fact, let me just copy and paste this command across. There we go. You'd simply do an ls on USR share KBD keymaps i386 ********************************************************** and then we pipe it through less so that we don't suddenly have the output going off the screen. So we can move up and down essentially. And what I actually want is the UK map, not the Dvorak map. So let's go all the way down here until I find the one I want, because I obviously want it to be set up to UK, and it's there, uk.mapgz. So press the Q to come out of there. What I then want to do is I want to set the keys to that uk.map.gz. And to do that, I use a command called load keys. Clearly, depending upon what your keyboard map is, the uk.map.gz is going to change. As I say, if you've got a US keyboard, you don't need to do any of this. So I've done that. What I also like to do, load keys is just a temporary setting. So it's not persistent across rebooting the machine. I like to make sure that it is persistent. So I also save the key map. In fact, I'm going to create that file by echoing keymap, all caps, equals UK across to etc vconsole.conf. Okay, all done. Now, you may be installing in standard BIOS mode, or you might be installing in EFI mode. To be honest, the procedure doesn't really change that much. If you're using an EFI system, there are some things that you've got to consider when you're doing the partitioning, and the installation of Grub is slightly different, but for the most part, it's exactly the same process. But if you've got an EFI system, it is always worth checking that you have booted in the correct mode. And to do this, you issue the command ls/sys/firmware/EFI/EFI vars. And as long as you've got something in that directory, and you can see I have here, you're all good. You're in EFI mode. So let me just clear that output. So all good. So what else do we need to do? Right, the first thing that I always do is I like to check that the clock is set correctly. So we issue this command. Time date CTL set NTP true. Doesn't matter if you're on a BIOS or an EFI system, always use this, and it'll go off to an NTP server and just check we're at the right time. Now we get to the next stage, partitioning. There are a number of different programs that you can use for this. Many people like to use fdisk, some like to use parted. Personally, I like to use cfdisk. It's completely up to you. I always start, though, if I can just get this to work, by issuing the command fdisk -l and having a look to see what the disk on my system is called. You can ignore the loop entry there. What I'm interested in is this entry here, dev SDA. So that's the name of the disk that I want to install Arch on. Right, so in order to open up that disk in cfdisk, I simply have to type cfdisk followed by the device name. Because this is a new disk, I'm immediately going to get asked to select a label type. What this actually means is your disk hasn't even got a partition table yet. What sort of partition table do you want to set up? Now, you can get quite complex in terms of different variations here, but let's keep things simple. If you're using an EFI system, go for GPT. If you're using a BIOS system, go for DOS. So you simply choose which one you want. I want GPT in this situation, so I'll select GPT and hit enter. Now, depending how you proceed from here, depends on whether you do have an EFI system or not. For an EFI system, you're going to have to create a minimum of 2 partitions. You're going to need an EFI partition itself, where your bootloader is going to be stored, and you're going to need a root partition. If you're just booting up in standard BIOS or legacy mode, you only need a root partition as a minimum. If you want to create separate home partitions as well, feel free, but as a minimum, you would just need a root partition. You also have the possibility of creating swap partitions here. Swap partitions, or the whole issue of do you need or do you not need a swap, has become a little bit of a moot point. You certainly need a swap partition if you are going to hibernate your system. Most of the time, if you have an SSD, you would tend to try and avoid that to cut down on the number of writes. And so you could get away without a swap partition as long as you have enough RAM. If you have a spinny disk, though, and you intend to hibernate, it's always a good idea to create a swap partition equal to the amount of RAM you have, up to, say, a maximum of around 8 gigs. I'll do a video on this at some point because it's never straightforward. But on this system here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create an EFI partition. I am going to create a little swap partition of 4 gig, and I'm also going to create my root partition. If this was a legacy installation, a BIOS installation in other words, I would just create the swap partition and the root partition. I tend to create everything from the top down and leave the root partition till last. That's personal preference. So you can see down here, it's asking me, or it's highlighted the word new. So I'm going to create my EFI, or as we call it, an ESP partition first. So partition size. For an EFI partition, I always go for 550 megs. Right, so that's created. I then want to go across to the type, and I'm just using my arrow keys here. I'm hitting enter again, and you'll see at the top there is an option there for EFI system. All good. I'm then, with my arrow keys, going to move down to the free space. I'm going to hit enter again for new, and I'm going to create a 4 gig partition, and I'm going to move to type, and I'm going to set that as my Linux swap. I'm then going to move down to the free space. There's 27.5 gigs left. I'm going to use all of it. I'm going to go to type again, and it's already set to Linux file system, so all good. I'm now going to write that partition table. Am I sure? You need to write the whole word here, yes, not just Y. And it's been written. If you were installing a legacy system, so you wouldn't have the first partition there, the EFI, basically my SDA1 would be my swap partition, and my SDA2 would be my file system. It might, of course, be that you're also installing on a dual boot system, so you might have some partitions in place already, which is great. If there's already an EFI partition there, leave it there. Don't touch it. Don't format it. Don't do anything with it. But you will obviously need a separate partition to install the system onto. If you are installing a legacy system, it's also important that on your root file system, the one I've got highlighted as well, that you set a boot flag. You'll have another option down here in CF disk, which allows you to set a particular partition as bootable. We haven't got it on ESP because it doesn't matter. So let me just quit that and clear again. And let me type fdisk-l just to check those partitions have been created. And I can now see we have SDA1 is an EFI partition, SDA2 is a swap partition, and my root partition, or what will be my root partition, is STA3. Now, I said before that if there's already an EFI system partition on your system, because you're going to multi-boot or dual boot, you don't need to format that. This is a brand new system for me. It's a raw system, so I'm going to format everything. And I'm going to start with my root partition, which in my case is SDA3. And I'm going to format that to ext4. So I issue the command makefs.ext4 and I point it to dev SDA3, which is my root partition. That's done. Next, I'm going to format my EFI system partition, SDA1, as a FAT32 file system. So the format for that is makefs.fat -F32, and that's dev SDA1. Done. Last but not least, I'm going to deal with the swap partition, and that's simply a case of make swap dev SDA2. So it's set that up, and I'm now going to turn on that swap partition. So swap on dev SDA2. Right, so that's our partitioning done. The next thing we want to do is we want to mount those partitions on our system so that we can install to them. I always start with my root partition, which in my case is dev SDA3. So I'm going to simply issue mount dev SDA3, and I'm going to mount that on /mount. So that's all you need to actually type for that. Mount dev SDA3 on mount, and that's mounted fine. If you're on a legacy system, that's all you need to do. For EFI systems, you really need to mount this EFI system as well, this EFI system partition. There are various ways that you can do this. The way that I do it is I mount it on boot /EFI. Now, there isn't a boot /EFI directory at the moment, so what I'm going to do is create that. So make directory, and remember we're mounted currently on mount. So mount /boot /EFI. Right, make directory -p. I'm going to use the -p option here for one very important reason. Although I'm asking it to create this EFI directory, if any of the preceding directories, such as boot, don't actually exist on the system at the moment, the -p option will make sure that they are created along the way. So that's done. I'm then going to mount dev SDA1, which, going up here, is my EFI system, on mount boot EFI. Right, so everything's mounted, the partitions have been created, we are now ready to start the installation. Right, so let me clear this screen so we can start off. We're going to use a command now called packstrap. And using the packstrap command and pointing it to MNT where the root partition is mounted, I'm going to install base-devel. I'm going to install the Linux kernel, so Linux and Linux-firmware. And I know you guys like to use Nano rather than Vim. You could use Vim if you wanted, but I'm going to install Nano, Less, Dialog, etc., and a couple of other utilities that are going to help us out. This thing called Dialog, I've included it here because if you're going to connect via Wi-Fi, that will need to be installed on the system so that you can still connect when you reboot. It's only necessary if you're not doing the installation over an Ethernet. So let me just issue that command, and it's synchronizing the directories, and this will take a while. We'll come back once it's done. Right, so we're done. That took about 3 or 4 minutes, that's all. And let me clear this screen. So we've now got the kernel and the base system installed. The next thing we need to do is we need to generate an fstab file. And Arch contains a utility where we can actually do that, gen fstab. If you follow along with my text file that's on my GitLab page, you will see the command is this. And that's done. And you can check it by doing a cat mnt mount etc fstab. And you can see fstab has now been created. So all good. It's picked up the partitions that are already mounted. Right, now we have to chroot into the main system. Arch makes this very easy. Rather than having to issue a load of different commands where you're mounting proc and sys and everything else, we just have to issue the command arch-chroot /mount, and you will see my prompt change. I have now chrooted into the installed system, or the system that's being installed, and it's essentially like I'm working in the new system that has been booted. Right, the first thing we want to do is we need to set our time zone. Now, this will obviously depend where you are in the world. So I know that for me, Europe/London is the key. And I need to link that to etc local time. If you want to have a look at time zone data to see what's available, and again, I'm going across to my text file, and I'm just going to copy and paste this command in. You would list USR share zone info, and you'll see all the different areas there. And they're folders which, again, you can CD into. So, all good. Right, I now want to generate my hardware clock setting. This assumes that your hardware clock is set to UTC. There we go. Next, I need to set up my localization. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can simply use nano that we've already done, and you could hit nano etc local.gen. You'll notice I'm not having to put mount in front anymore because I'm chrooted into the system. And you can have a look at all the different locales that are listed there. And what you need to do is to uncomment the one that relates to your area. I'm not going to do that because I already know what I'm going to do. So I'm just echoing engb.utf-8 UTF-8 across to etc localgen. Okay, good. We then need to run the command localgen, and it's going to generate that locale, as you can see. Generation complete. Brilliant. I'm now going to export that or save it to locale.conf by using this command. Whatever locale n_gb.utf-8 that you identified in the previous step, you can echo that direct into etc local.conf. You don't need the second UTF-8 for this. So that's all done. And finally, I'm just going to export my language. Again, engb.utf-8. I'm essentially following the Arch wiki now to set up my locale and language. Okay, next. Decide on your host name. What do you want to call the system? I'm going to call this OTB Arch, and I'm going to send that across to the etc hostname file. That's that done. Then I'm going to edit. So I'm using Nano, which I installed on the previous situation. I'm going to edit etc hosts. The file is currently empty, but I am going to put this into it. Let me just clean up that spacing. I hate bad spacing. There we go. This is on the Arch wiki, the details of this. It is also in the text file that's on my GitLab. It's the same for everybody except for the host name that you've set up. And you include that on that last line. So let me just save that. Right, so that's the host setup. A step that I always take at this point, I remake the init RAM FS. Now, you don't technically need to do that anymore. I like to do it just to make sure that the kernel and everything has been installed properly. So I'm just going to let it run through the process because I have occasionally got a few errors at this stage, so I find it useful to run this. Brilliant. So let's clear that. And we're now at the stage of adding our normal user. You will have noticed already there is only a root user currently on the system. So I want to create a user called OTB. Yeah. So user add -m -G, and I'm adding that user to a couple of groups. The most important here is the wheel group, because I'm going to use that to set up sudo shortly. But the other groups can help you out when you have your system installed. If you're a member of the sys group, for instance, you can manage your printers. So, all good. I'm now going to create a password for that user, and I simply issue password, PASSWD, so not the full word, and it's for a user, OTB, and again. Great. So my user is set up and I've created a password. What I'm now going to do, and I might as well do this here and now, is set up sudo, and I'm going to use nano as the editor for that. So editor equals nano vi sudo, and I'm going to go all the way down here until I find the entry that references the wheel group. And it says uncomment to allow members of group wheel to execute any command. So I'm just going to delete the comment, save that, and come out. That's why I added OTB, the user, to the wheel group, because setting up sudo, that's all you need to do. Okay, so we now get to the point where I want to sync my repos, I want to optimize my mirror list, and I want to enable multi-lib. I always do this at this stage. And to do this, I would go into etc pacman.conf. And I'm going to go all the way down in this file. And you can see at the moment we've got core, extra, and community repos uncommented. I also want to uncomment multi-lib. Be careful here because there's a multi-lib testing as well, and that's not the one I want. So I'm going to remove the hash sign from that multi-lib entry. You will need to remove it from both portions. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to issue pacman SYY to update those repos. And you can see multi-lib has now been added. Now, one more thing, and this isn't absolutely essential at this stage, but I want to optimize my mirrors to make sure that I am getting the fastest mirrors possible. And I'm going to use a little package that we installed earlier called Reflector. And you can see this command that I've just pasted in. What you will need to do is to change the name of your country. This is set up for United Kingdom. And I just run it. And that actually makes sure that my mirrors are the fastest in the United Kingdom. Let me resync the repositories. All good. We're nearly there, guys. What we're now going to be doing is installing Grub. Now, this varies slightly depending on whether you've set up an EFI system or a legacy system. For an EFI system, this would be the command that you enter. pacman -s grub EFI boot manager OS prober. If you were setting up this system on a legacy system, you wouldn't need to install EFI boot manager. Okay, so you would just have pacman -s grub OS prober. So let's install those. Proceed with installation, yes please. And we now need to install Grub to wherever we want it to live. On a legacy system, it's really simple. You would just do a grub-install dev whatever your root partition is. Or sorry, whatever your disk is. So it would be grub-install /dev/STA. That's all you need to type. For an EFI system, you need a few more details. And I'm just copying what you would put here. So grub install. The target, I want the EFI grub executable installed. I'm giving it an ID. You don't necessarily need to put this, but I tend to do it. But most importantly, I'm pointing it to the EFI directory that I have already mounted, that boot /EFI directory. So, installation finished, no errors reported. So, all good. Last but not least, I need to generate a boot configuration. Doesn't matter if you're legacy or EFI, you would issue this command. All done. Right, now, at this stage, and if you look at the wiki, the Arch wiki, it tells you can now reboot and continue to configure your system once you've rebooted. That's probably advisable, just to check that Grub is working properly. Don't forget that if it's not and you need to go back into your system to reconfigure it, it's easy enough. You use your Arch ISO, go back in, remount the partitions, and do an Arch -ch root, and you can continue working on your system. For simplicity, and because everything seems to be working now, I'm actually not going to reboot at this stage. I am going to install some packages. And the packages that I'm going to install, I'm going to install Xorg. I'm also going to install some utilities such as NTFS 3G and Fuse. I'm going to install Pulse Audio here, DKMS, and unrar, unzip. Oh, and my Firefox web browser. So, enter a selection. The default is all. I'm just going to stick with all. And the default, proceed with installation, yes. So let's get those installed and I'll come back in a sec. Right, so we're back. That only took 3 or 4 minutes again. I'm going to clear the screen. I tend to do this in stages. I'm now issuing yet another command. And here what I actually want to do is I want to install Network Manager. I want to install a backend for printing cups. And I also want to install a display manager. I'm going to use Light DM. And some fonts, because if you don't install any fonts at this stage, when you get to your desktop environment, it's going to look horrible. So I'm going to click yes, and we'll come back again once that's done. Right, so that's Network Manager and printing, a display manager and some fonts installed. We now finally get to the desktop environment. We've got Xorg already done, so I'm just going to install Marte, and it's a really short command. Pacman -s, Marte, Marte extra. Default all, proceed with installation, yes, and again, we'll come back once that's done. Right, so we're done again. That didn't take long. As you can see, it's the partitioning stage that takes longer than anything. The last stage before we reboot is we need to enable some services. The first one being LightDM. So systemctl enable lightdm.service. That's done. Let's also enable Network Manager. That's done. And let's enable cups. So the reason we've done this, we want our desktop manager to show up when we reboot. We want Network Manager to be working and to have the Network Manager applet showing up in our Marte desktop. And we want to be able to print. Okay, so we're about to reboot and just finalize the installation. Type exit at this point, and we're out of the Shroot environment. I then want to unmount dev SDA1, which is my ESP partition, and also SDA3, which is my root partition. And now I'm going to reboot, and we'll come back once I've rebooted and I've got the Marte desktop up and running. So I've just rebooted, and as you can see, I'm at the LightDM screen. There is no guest additions here, so I've not got the full resolution. So let's just boot in, and hopefully we get to a vanilla Marte desktop. And yes, we do. It's not a full resolution, but that's pretty much what I wanted. You can see that Network Manager is there already, which is great. There's nothing here apart from the standard Marte programs and Firefox, which I added to make sure that you've got a web browser to start you off with. And at this point, it's over to you. You'll probably want to install the microcode for your Intel or AMD CPU. You'll want to install various codecs, programs, and theme it to your liking. But this is the fun part. Now that you've got everything sorted, the rest is just about customization. You may well want to install Yay and AUR helper as well. That's fairly straightforward to do, and I'll leave instructions in my text file about how you do that. But for now, let's go and have a chat. So that was relatively straightforward. The most complex part is the partitioning, which you probably already know. Once you've done the partitioning, the rest is just a few commands you need to insert there, and then install your packages. What you'll end up with if you follow this guide is a very basic desktop environment. for you to build up as you see fit. Use it and abuse it by all means. Let me know what you think. I'm sure not everybody will agree with the way that I particularly do things, but it's the way that's worked for me. I've been trying to be quite verbose about differences between bias and EFI, because I know some of the guys on my Facebook group have asked me to kind of go into detail on that, and so that's what I've tried to do. So I hope you enjoy it. Give it a go. Play with it in VirtualBox if nothing else, and see what you think. That's it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to join me on LBRY. Have a great day.